Welcome everyone to our interview series. We're really lucky today to be joined by Louise Fowler. She has over 25 years of marketing, customer and digital experience at a senior level in the travel and financial services industries. Louise began her career at British Airways, and in recent years, she's been working as an independent consultant for brands such as the Post Office, M&S, and in various non-executive and director roles. Louise now runs a Davenport strategy, an independent consultancy specializing in helping regulated service businesses define and deliver breakthrough customer strategies. And so today we're going to learn all about her career and also going to learn some takeaways that we can apply to our own businesses. So let's jump straight in. So first question is, what was it that inspired you initially to get into the travel world? Because it's a fascinating industry.
Well, it was then. It was, to be honest, BA had a fantastic graduate scheme, and I came out of university, didn't want to do the milk round, didn't want to do a graduate scheme, got a job in a wine consultancy, actually, advising people on buying wines. But the business was really small, and although they were fantastic, they didn't have the resources to give me the training I needed. So I went from sort of one extreme right up to the other to pick a big graduate programme. And BA's was brilliant. I mean, this was a while back, but they took a very small number of graduates and they trained you in all the different parts of the business with the view to you building your own career in senior management. And I went thinking I'd stay 2 to 3 years and get some experience. 15 years later, I thought it really was time to leave, but had the chance to go all around the world and try many, many different things. And yeah, it is an absolutely fantastic industry full of brilliant people who do it because they're passionate and enthusiastic about the world and the people in it.
And one really fascinating part of your career journey for me is, nowadays when we get on planes and if we're lucky enough to turn left when we get on, we take it for granted that there's flatbeds and, this great proposition for business travel. But you were right there at the beginning, and actually helped to launch British Airways Executive Club and also pioneered flatbeds in travel. And it'd be great to talk through that process because at the time, those were two quite big leaps of innovation in airline service.
They were, yes. Well, and BA, I mean, this is back into the 80s and early 90s, and BA was really riding high. They had money to invest, and it was a really brave company. I mean, my hat's off to them. They backed innovation with money and resource. And I honestly, I think I was too junior and too experienced not to know what was not possible. So the flatbeds, for example, we did research into our customers. What did they need? We had competitors coming in who'd never been in the market before, like Virgin, like Singapore, Emirates, and so on. And we just asked customers, what do you need? And it wasn't champagne and it wasn't fancy, meals and films. It was the ability to get a good night's sleep. And you can't sleep in a chair. It's just, you just can't. So we went all around saying, we've got to have a bed on board. And people laughed at us. They said, you don't be silly. And they said, first of all, you have to, there won't be room for enough passengers to make it commercially viable. Then they said you'd have to have a seat because it's not safe. You have to be upright for takeoff and landing. So then they said you have to have a seat and a bed, and it all got very complicated. But we just worked through and we were determined to make it happen. We invited a firm of yacht designers to come and help us design it because aircraft manufacturers just said it couldn't be done. And in all fairness to the management of BA, when we presented the business case and we showed what we thought we could do, they said, all right then, go and do it. And I'm extremely proud because it's really one of the very few times in your career you can go from start to finish with a project. And it changed the face of an industry. As you say, people now expect it, but at the time it was genuinely breakthrough.
And what do you think it is that's changed in airline world? Because, we saw this huge period of growth where airlines were doing great, business travel was on the up, and, COVID aside, because, we have this natural disaster that's affected us all. But even aside from that, there was definitely a sense of stagnation and decline in travel and in airlines. Why do you think that is? And what do you think it would take for that industry to really rejuvenate its fortunes?
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? I mean, fundamentally, I think it's the economics. It is just really expensive, both financially, of course, but also now environmentally as well, to carry people around the world. And when the industry completely deregulated, there were loads and loads of competitors piled in. that were carrying passengers below the cost of travel. And still on short haul, many of these airlines are carrying passengers way below what it costs them to fly them.
Wow.
So it's economically non-viable. So airlines like BA and some of the bigger ones that were covering all of their costs and seeking to make a profit have found it very difficult and have had to turn down service and, you know, try and find ways of being more efficient with their staffing and their airplane usage. That means, I'm afraid, the customer experience isn't as good as it used to be. Now, you could argue many, many more people have access to flying, so maybe it's better that it's more democratic and not quite as lovely. But I do have a bit of a bee in my bonnet that we should only really be carrying people where it's commercially and environmentally sustainable to do so. And maybe a bit of consolidation needs to happen. And maybe this awful disaster of COVID might precipitate that a little bit, which will be very painful, but perhaps the industry could come out stronger after, who knows?
Yeah. And, you know, moving forward in your career, you know, we saw that, you know, innovations played a big role through every role you've had. And, you know, I noted that you were there launching the UK's first black box telematics insurance product, which when it comes to market, you think, of course this should exist. It makes really intuitive sense. But the fact is, there's quite a long process of innovation, and not just around the product, but around the fact that this is a very, very regulated industry and thus often resistant to change. So it'd be great just to talk through how that happened and how that product came to market in actually a very tightly regulated world.
Yeah. Well, so I'm a marketer. That's what I do. And for me, marketing is not really about the communications and the advertising. It's about the customer. And if you start with the customer and understand what they need and want and how you can bring value to them, in my experience, usually good stuff follows. Mm-hmm. And the telematics technology wasn't new. It existed. It already existed in lots of industries, and the insurance market was starting to play with it, but very much from a point of view of how can we make money? So how can we either get less risky customers or charge them more or do something, you know, nothing wrong with that, you're a commercial business, but how can we as a business do better? And what we did was flip it on its head, actually, and say, what's the value to the customer? How can this be useful to somebody so that they're going to want it? And what we worked out was, and as you see now, a lot of insurance companies use it to say, if you can see that you're driving more safely, we can give you a reduction in your costs. But we thought, what's the target market that's going to best benefit from that? And it was young drivers. So drivers with no experience, who were hugely expensive to insure, usually on their parents' cars initially. So we created a new product exactly for that, giving them a smartphone app so that they could see how they were driving, whether they were accelerating, braking too quickly, cornering too fast, and actually giving them a discount and a rebate off it. And it was so successful, actually, that the young people who were driving were then showing their apps to their parents, who were also using the car, saying, look, Mum, you drove really badly to the supermarket last week. So actually the whole experience was that, you know, all of the drivers changed their behaviour ever so slightly, and premiums came down a little bit, but the risk factor came down more for the insurance company. So if you can show the value to the customer, I think that's when magic starts to happen.
And do you think that there are any learnings that you could share? Because so many industries are faced with these kind of regulatory parameters. So whether we think about law, financial services, insurance, travel, lots of industries have tight regulatory parameters, which often mean that the leadership of those businesses do feel that innovation is something which they can't do because they're a highly regulated world. But the reality is they can and should innovate. And it would be great if you could just share some reflections on, you know, for leaders who are watching this from those kinds of industries, how do you start to build the business case for innovation? And also, how do you create the space in your business with those regulations in place to do it?
Yeah, I think it is. It's hard, and regulation is there for a really good reason. So you know, there are always times when we get a bit frustrated with a particular regulation that seems a bit balmy, but always these things have been created for a very good reason. And going back to my airline days, you know, safety is a pretty important thing. You know, nobody wants an airline not to be regulated for safety. Same with financial services. Looking after your money kind of matters. So I think you have to take it really seriously. But you have to remember what it's trying to do. And I think all the regulators I've encountered, certainly, are actually quite reasonable. And when you understand what they're trying to achieve with the regulation, And then you think, well, the customer needs this. Going back to British Airways, the customer needs to get flat to sleep. I'm not allowed, for safety reasons, to have people lying on beds at takeoff and landing because it's not safe. So I can't do that. Let's not argue with that. Then you can start to get quite creative about how do we solve that problem. And if you can't do it internally, one of the great things that I think works in innovation is steal ideas from other people who've already solved the problem in a different scenario. Hence in BA, we brought in yacht designers. In other industries, we've had a range of people who've had nothing to do with the industry come in and talk about how they've tackled problems. So I think innovation, I think, is an unhelpful word because it kind of suggests something wacky and new that no one's ever thought of before. And actually what I think it is creative problem solving. And if you really understand your customer and what problem they've got, and then you can think about how could we solve that problem in a new way that isn't just doing the same thing the industry's always done, and make a business case for it. You know, there's got to be value in it both for the customer and the organisation. My experience is that businesses and regulators aren't opposed to that. They just want to see it done in the proper way to make sure you're not compromising the standards that exist.
And I think it's also perhaps a truism that, you know, in many of the businesses that I go into as well, you see that innovation tends to be put into the technical team.
Yes.
Whereas actually, you know, from your experience and the businesses that really succeed, marketing plays a deep and critical role in innovation. You know, why do you think so many businesses disconnect marketing from innovation? And how could the process be better from bringing those worlds together?
Oh, such a good question. Do you know, I think we marketers have done the world's worst marketing job on marketing. We've just got to sort it out. So somehow, and I don't really know how, over the last 30 years, marketing has come to mean communications. And actually a little bit of fluffy colouring in stuff that gets done at the end. And, you know, I paraphrase it, but I nearly had this conversation in one of the financial services businesses I work for, not NatWest, who said, we've got a product, marketing, can you make people want it, please? Now, that is not how it works.
Yes,
and marketing
exactly.
to me is the discipline and rigorous process of understanding your market, understanding your customers, developing commercially viable propositions for them, and then taking them to market in a way that involves communication and distribution and so on. So it's that whole end-to-end process, and it has to be part of the strategy of the business. So I think if a business thinks its marketing team is there at the end of the process just to make the adverts or the social media posts look good, they've completely misunderstood what marketing is.
Wow. And there's also a brand equity piece because, you know, you were chief marketing and digital officer at the post office for a period of time. And the thing that I thought was really interesting about that world is it's not a traditional business in the sense that there is a traditional consumer relationship. There is a very deep and very emotive relationship between the public and the post office who see it as part of our national identity. So when you go into a role like that, you know, how do you balance the need to be the custodian of this public asset with all of its historical narrative and stories, with the need for the post office as a business to also move forward into the next century?
Well, yes, post office was a fantastic experience for me, and we all love it, and it is a brilliant business. And actually, it was the reason I was so keen to work with them. It was the opposite problem to the one I had all through my career. So all through my career, I'd worked with really professional businesses with fabulous products and very, very savvy in a commercial and rigorous sense that were struggling with their brands to make the brands appealing and human and warm and likable, and really make people emotionally connect with them. In the post office, it was the completely opposite. As you said, everyone loves it. It's his heritage, it's history. It's you know, it's the retailer of last resort in every village. You know, we will have a post office and a pub if we have nothing else. So actually, the problem was how you converted that emotion into something really value adding that made people buy from it. Because clearly, it's a public service, but it now has done a fantastic job and it covers its own costs, so it's not a burden on the taxpayer. And the way we did that was by finding lots of things that consumers, whether they come into the branch or they buy online, value and want a business they really trust, like the post office, to sell it to them. So that was the opposite problem. It was converting that goodwill into real value in terms of proposition for the customer and commercial returns for the organisation. So that was fun.
Yeah. I'd like to just pick up on that point about trust, though, because, we've seen in recent years, whether we talk about, the current antitrust hearings in the US, which are looking at the relationship between tech companies in the market, whether it's, how companies are handling data in Europe, or who to believe, with all these kind of conspiracy theories around big pharma, there seems to be a sort of challenge that the corporate world in particular is facing with regards to building and maintaining trust with consumers. Why do you think we're seeing somewhat of a breakdown in trust between corporate land and Main Street, as it were? And what do you think businesses could do to kind of build and retain trust with the public?
Yeah, this is a difficult one, isn't it? I don't think it's just businesses, actually. I think we're seeing a breakdown in trust across everything, big institutions, government, infrastructure. I think communities are genuinely a little bit less trustful and less respectful of hierarchy and authority, which is probably not a bad thing, actually. I do find this difficult because I've spent nearly 30 years now working with big corporates, boards, leadership positions. And I can honestly say I have never experienced anything that was deliberately underhand, get away with something. It happens, of course it does, and the newspapers report it. And I think those very sensationalist stories do taint the reputation of big business. And perhaps people who've never worked in it therefore conclude everyone is like that. But that is not my experience. Most people want to come to work to do a good job, to make the world a little bit better, earn a little bit of money, and go home feeling okay about themselves. But I do think, with social media, with increased information all over the place, I do think we're perhaps slightly better informed and worse informed. So we hear more about the occasions where perhaps some individual or small group of people have done something wrong. That becomes more sensationalist. And because we know what we don't know, we perhaps therefore trust people a little bit less. And, a little bit of mistrust isn't a bad thing. But organisations do need to be very careful that they treat that reputation and that conversation with the client and the wider world with respect and with thought to that, because I think big organisations can be a little bit arrogant if they're not careful.
And do you think that organisations ought to have a perspective on most social issues? And the reason I ask that is, historically you saw that where a business came head to head with a social issue that was relevant to that business, for example, oil and climate change, there was a natural reason for that business to have a perspective. But what we're seeing now is that the pressures of social media mean that businesses are feeling they ought to have a perspective on any big social issue, irrespective of the direct or indirect relevance to them. One classic example is, when people were rightly protesting about racial injustice, every business felt it ought to now make a press statement about it in a way. What are your views on that? Because it seems that more and more this is going to be happening. More and more small and large businesses are going to be up against social media requests or pressure to have a perspective. What's the right way to deal with that?
Yes, and it's not just social media, is it? I mean, I sit on a couple of boards, and shareholders are now demanding information about your approach to these big moral and societal questions. So I think it is a shift in the way the world is. And my personal perspective is good, about time too. Businesses, even smallish businesses, have a huge impact on society and communities. So to think you're only there to make money for your shareholders or your owners is I think, immoral. You have a responsibility to be a good neighbour, a good citizen, and use the power you have to make society a little bit better. We all have that responsibility, whether we're an individual or an organisation. So I think it's good. I think there's a real risk, and we've seen a lot of it recently, where organisations, because they think marketing is just communications, think if I just slap a message out there, it'll be okay, won't it? Now, we're all human beings, and we are all born with an excellent authenticity radar. And the minute we know it's not authentic, we sniff it out and won't have anything to do with it. And through COVID, I don't know how many you've had, but I've probably had about 10 emails a day from the CEO of some business I once bought one thing off 10 years ago, telling me how concerned he was for my family and my well-being.
Yeah.
Don't like it, stop it. In fact, you've put me right off your business now.
Correct. Yeah.
So I think businesses have to do it. I think it's good that we're demanding of them. But what we're demanding as reasonably well-informed consumers and members of society is that they do something meaningful and real and authentic, not just a bit of washing over the front of their brand that makes us think, oh, aren't they lovely?
Yeah, exactly. And one kind of roundup question, if I may, to close off, which is, you've had the privilege of seeing so many different businesses in varying states of success and gone in to kind of either turn them around or to grow them even further. Are there any common traits that you see in businesses? Are there any common things that you see where in most businesses that you would go into, you would be saying to them, look, here are the 3 things that you really need to do to get your marketing in shape for this coming much more information driven marketing world?
Yes, I mean, yes. So the problems, whilst each business is unique and different, each market is unique and different, the problems are pretty common. But you have to tackle them in a way that's true and authentic to you and your brand. So the solutions are not the same. And I think it'd be very arrogant of anybody to come into business and say, oh, I know how to solve that problem, because you don't in that context. But the truth is, yes, I mean, I think understanding that marketing is a strategic function that understands markets, propositions, needs to orchestrate the whole business behind the delivery of that proposition and then communicate it. I think that's a really important thing. Really understanding the customer is the thing that I think is the most important. And the number of businesses I've worked with, even in my consultancy where I work with tens of businesses every year, they will all tell me they're really good at it, and most of them are not. And actually, when you help them understand what being good at it means, they will agree they were not. So that's not a kind of me being a slightly sniffy marketer saying, you're not very good. It's an easy thing to say. And, having a kind of customer satisfaction survey 4 times a year, ticking that box, everyone goes, oh, aren't we good? No, you really need to get that insight that nobody else has got, even though they have access to the same information that you have about what your customers need and what they want. So I think that is the big thing. And then the other thing for me that I'm very passionate about in a marketing sense is I think too many marketers think it's about creativity and not about commerciality.
Yeah.
And marketing should be about the growth of the business, the bringing of income, the selling of product, the solving of customer problems in exchange for money or goods or whatever it is. So it has to be commercial and rigorous and professionally measured and run. And if we've done ourselves a disservice as marketers, we've been too sort of creative and not commercial enough in terms of the business success, I think.
Wow. And thank you so much for joining us today for Leadership
Thank
Insights.
you for having me.
It's been fascinating, and I've just been, as you're speaking, making notes about what I'm going to talk to my CMO about after this. But it's been a pleasure to have you on, and I'm sure everyone's going to really enjoy listening back to these insights. So thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next Leadership Insights.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Thank you for having me.